I think we can start. Good evening. I am Elisa Nicolopoulou, a psychoanalyst, member of the Hellenic Psychoanalytic Society, and of the board of the Delphi International Psychoanalytic Symposium. On behalf of the board of the symposium and of its president, Elisa I would like to welcome you all to this webinar and especially express my gratitude to Ms. Aisenstein for her immediate and generous acceptance of our invitation. So just a few words for those of you who are not familiar with the Delphi Symposium. When it was first held some 40 years ago, in 1984, the basic idea of Dr. Hartokolis, who initiated it with some of his colleagues from Canada, was to create an opportunity and a forum where scientists of various humanitarian disciplines from all over the world could meet and exchange ideas and research on psychoanalytic issues, thus promoting freedom of thought in a context of high-level scientific discourse, along with artistic expression of various kinds. And this goal remains actual till today. You can find more information on our website for the 9 symposia held since 1984. For the 10th symposium, which will be held in August 2026, the theme chosen is authority and authoritarianism. As stated in the rationale of this choice, we hope that this general theme will give us the opportunity to explore and to elaborate on, during the symposium, but during also the pre-symposiums, on various questions related to psychoanalysis, such as the relevance that authoritarianism and authority may have for the analyst-analysant relationship, or the manifestation on a group within, for example, psychoanalytic institutions, as well as in society. The question is more generally to explore what can psychoanalysis tell us today about those concepts. Since the symposium is held every 4 years, and in order to better prepare it, the board organizing the 10th International Symposium decided to propose pre-symposiums webinars as this one. And as some of you may remember, the first one took place last May with Michael Parsons as presenter, Soteris Manolopoulos as discussant, and Dimitris Jackson as moderator. So our guest today is Marilia Aisenstein, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce her, though most of you may know her either from her writings or by having worked with her. So just a few words. With a background in philosophy, Marilia Aisenstein is a training and supervising analyst in the Hellenic Psychoanalytic Society and in the Paris Society, of which she has served as president. She is also an international distinguished fellow in the BRAS, the British Society. She has worked for 22 years at the Paris Psychosomatic Institute and was president of its executive committee. And indeed, we owe her many fundamental papers regarding psychosomatics. Former representative of Europe at the IPA's executive committee, she also was the chair of the International New Groups Committee. As you know, she has written numerous papers and books in French, English, and Greek, several of which have been translated in many languages. Her latest book was translated in 2023 in English by Routledge under the title Desire, Pain, and Thought. The topic of Ms. Aisenstein's today, the topic of her talk today is authoritarianism and fanaticism. So as for one word for the procedure, you will be able to send your question in written in the Q&A box or chat box so that I can address them to Ms. Aisenstein after her talk. Authoritarianism and Fanaticism. Ms. Aisenstein, la parole est à vous.
Thank you. Yes, I accepted gratefully this invitation because I thought that authority and authoritarianism was a very thought-provoking title. The question posed by this argument, authority and authoritarianism, is indeed worth pondering. These two words have the same root, but contradictory meanings. In the field of analysis, authority has a positive valence, and I associate it with the famous analysis of the rat man by Freud, the moment when the patient falls silent, stands up, and cannot continue his account of a Chinese torture. At that point, Freud forces him to complete the words, to go back to the couch, and to complete the words in the anus, and explain to the patient that he himself is under the obligation of demanding this of his analysant. He writes, I assure him that I have no inclination for cruelty, and certainly have no desire to torment him. But that, of course, I cannot exempt him from something over which I have no power. It's in the diary of an analysis. I understand authority as a turn of mind or a directive but protective attitude. For example, any sensible adult will forbid a child to play with fire. In psychoanalytic societies, in psychoanalytic clinical practice, both protagonists in the treatment are subject to the rules imposed by the analytic frame. These rules are understandable and freely consented to. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, concerns the negative valence of authority and immediately brings to my mind a book that I read and commented long ago in 2010. The author of this book, Manuela Utrilla Robles, was a remarkable analyst, ex-president of the Madrid Society and European representative in the IPA's board. I would say that based on dogmatism, hatred of differences, and the will to power, the word fanaticism can be replaced by authoritarianism. In her book, the author offers a lucid and courageous study of the fate of idealization and submission alike. And indeed, analytical societies are vulnerable for contrary to the spirit of analysis, intolerance, fanaticism in all its forms can unfortunately reign with what I would call intellectual terrorism. Small societies are more fragile than others, and initial difficulties and conflicts are passed on from one generation to the next. Having been chair of the IPA New Groups Committee, I can confirm that far from calming down over the time, fundamental conflicts tend to repeat themselves tirelessly. We denounce, as an analyst, the repetition compulsion, but we do not escape it. As early as 1921, Freud describes the regression of the superego in crowds in favor of an ego ideal based on the leader, whoever he may be. Here we find idealization and submission. To find the roots of fanaticism, we can refer to Freud, Klein, Winnicott, Bion, Anzieux, Chasgues-Chermel, and others, but also to philosophers and writers as Aristotle, Plotinus, Russell, Orwell, Stefan Zweig. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. Fanaticism is based on dogmatism, lack of critical thinking, hatred of difference, and the will to power. These traits are more common in psychopathic personalities who combine a lack of guilt with a high degree of seduction. We could say that their superego is dominated by their ego ideal. Under the title Intellectual Terrorism, Manuela Utrilla delivers a striking portrait from the very first pages of her book. She portraits a small imaginary analytic society where a highly renowned colleague, recognized for her intellectual abilities, but described as manipulative and hungry, would have reigned over several generations of psychoanalysts. Her capacity for seduction would be immense, as would the sadism and destructiveness she would have exercised without limits. Her destabilizing techniques were based on the open contempt for what she called the lack of talent or the little theoretical knowledge of all her colleagues, as well as on the fleeting friendship that led her to elect younger members of the society, whom she showered with compliments, and for whom she claimed to be protective friend. For a time, of course. Shortly after, under the veil of secrecy, she would report malicious remarks made about them by their colleagues. These cunningly repeated stratagems would lead to a generalized distrust of one to another, giving way to a poisonous atmosphere among the members of this society, for everyone distrust everyone else. The same person was constantly lamenting on the poor general standards of the society, relentlessly attacking the self-esteem of all her colleagues. I found this case study very interesting because it reveals a terrifying reality that it does take much, just one person, to undermine a psychoanalytical institution. And that is very frightening. While pathognomonic of what we call narcissistic perversion, this description has the advantage of highlighting the other side of this phenomenon. I mean, the extreme submission of most analysts to such personality as soon as they use intellectual power. We can go back to Heraclitus and the sources of Manichaeism founded in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century by the prophet Mani. Mani describes the world as governed by two irreducible, mutually independent principles, a strict good, evil, true, false dichotomy. A study of Manichaeism by a Swiss psychoanalyst whose name is Michel Gressot was published in the French Review of Psychoanalysis in 1953 and proposes a relationship between a tendency toward Manichaeism and projection, and indeed intolerance and Manichaeism lead to fanaticism. Omnipotence is often combined with destructiveness. If the castration complex has not been properly worked out, this omnipotence risks becoming grandiosity, the other side of castration anxiety. This contributes to the psychic construction of a leader. But charismatic leaders also create their followers for whom not thinking is very comfortable. The crucial issue is that to become a charismatic leader, to surround oneself with a group, to carry it forwards to form an analytical society, to fight to have it recognized by one's peers, requires a certain passion for ideal with which the subject seems to be himself totally identified. Grandiosity and fanaticism are not far at all. In such personalities, these characteristics undoubtedly exist in an embryonic state, but usually they are hardly visible at the outset. What are the conditions that bring them to a climax? Too long in power, age, flattery? I'd like to think they're linked to an underlying narcissistic fragility. To be a leader, you need a solid narcissism, but there are gaps and holes that nothing can fill. In such cases, Rosenfeld describes the narcissistic shell which protects integrity of the subject in danger. There are several possible scenarios. There are leaders whom the exercise of power tranquilizes and enhances. These are what I simply call the good leaders. They show themselves capable of completing their mandate and investing in other projects. But others, on the other hand, seem unable to live without what they see as their mission. In the case of those I'm talking about, to educate, convince, and transform the others, the young people, in their own image. I remembered that in an interview I gave in 2009 to the Hellenic magazine Oedipus, I wrote that the last few years of a sponsoring committee work often consisted in protecting fledgling societies from their initial charismatic leaders. When they lose the absolute power, they often become insanely destructive, both to themselves and to the other. Freud's 1923 paper, Mass Psychology and Ego Analysis, in which he seeks to better understand the regression of the superego in crowds as he holds of the idea, this paper is really a mass trade. What's going on then? that psychoanalytical societies are unable to take advantage of it. Freud describes this form of superego regression induced by the group situation. In my opinion, we should have to turn to group analysts here, but the number of analytic societies able to call on them a group analyst can be counted on my fingers. Freud describes this form of superego regression induced by the group. To tell you the truth, I personally know only one society that had the courage to do so and that has subsequently congratulated itself. Yet, some big companies do not hesitate to call in specialists. Psychoanalytical associations, on the other hand, show themselves very reluctant. Can we imagine that if narcissistic charismatic leaders are so cautious, it's because whether consciously or unconsciously, their desire is not to reveal latent conflicts, nor to train young colleagues who are independent in their thinking, and therefore can sometimes be critical, but they want to produce clones. It's a terrifying vision, and one can't help but think of the nightmare portrait described by George Orwell in 1984. There is often confusion between transmission and education. But to transmit psychoanalysis is, in my view, to transmit freedom, inner freedom. And there are some institutions where instead of transmitting, we educate, totally different. Take, for example, a clinical seminar in which a candidate presents material from a treatment, and others young are invited to express their idea freely. There is one supervisor with them. If instead of talking up and discussing each one's idea and restoring their theoretical coherence, the supervisor remains silent only in the last 5 minutes, gives the good interpretation without taking any account of what had been said up to that point, he is forcing the admiration but destroying the self-esteem of participants. What's more, the message Constance received is, either you want to be like me or you are against me. I must confess to having witnessed and heard stories of such scenarios, and this in small society where there are few leaders and where humiliated candidates have not the possibility of moving from one group to the other. It's much more difficult when you have a society like the Paris Society with 800 members and 90 supervisors. Of course, there are groups, and one or two cannot dominate everything. In such cases, they seem to either submit or become loyal vassals, or they go into becoming depressed. The factor behind this depression are the lack of respect to which they are subjected and the ensuing loss of dignity. In the type of societies I just described, all it takes is one or two such leaders among the founders for the group to function symbiotically by exclusion. Any candidate or member, however gifted, who speaks out or refuses to bow down is excluded. As far as candidates are concerned, this presents no difficulties. As far as members are concerned, there are no forums or seminars. These are Psychoanalytic Society whose teaching program is institutional. Candidates are not encouraged to organize working groups. If they do, they take the floor. If they do, the old colleagues will take a newspaper or chat or comment absolutely nothing. In general, the secretariat is put to work. Their letters are misled. They never find any rooms for them, and so on. The extreme subservience of the individuals who make up these groups to politic is the most negative sense of the word of this society is appalling. It may seem absurd to compare the working of an association of analysts such the International Psychoanalytic Association with governors of a country. Yet, we can find the same ingredients: thirst for power, fanaticism, exacerbated narcissism on one hand, and on the other, submission, fear of refusal to think, and identification with the aggressor. Manuela Utrella's book prompted me to reflect not only on analytical association, but also on myself. In varying degrees, intolerance is the prerogative of the human beings in general. In the societies whose training follows the Aitingan model, seminars are compulsory, and teaching is regulated by year or semester. Is decided and organized by the training committee. Working groups may be proposed by training or full members, but must be approved by the training committee to be valid. This is a university model in my mind. The French model may seem more open, but I must say it's terribly elitist. Finally, whether the field of analysis or in life, we have to read all of us what difference worries us, and it's easier to be hostile to it than to welcome something new. To this, we can simply think of the banality of racism. We analysts would like to believe that analysis protects us from radical intolerance and definitive certainties. But unfortunately, this is not true. Even if, curiously enough, it is often true in our practice with our patients. I've long been convinced that the most obnoxious analyst in the society can turn out to be patient, gifted clinicians, humane, and respectful to their patients. This is a contradiction worth exploring. The explanation that we confine ourselves to the professional sphere and let ourselves go with our colleagues is certainly true, but not enough to understand this odd contradiction. Contrary to the long way already advocated by Freud in 1911 in the two principles of mental functioning, fanaticism or intellectual terrorism is a short way. And indeed, Bion evoked and advocated that what he called the negative capacity, that means the ability to accept doubt, uncertainty, and sometimes ignorance. In a very fine book, alas somewhat forgotten, French psychoanalyst Janine Chasgues-Mirguel denounced the triumph of the short route over the long one, because the latter involved depression, trial and error, humility, uncertainty, and is therefore comparable to a very, very long journey. Laborious, demanding, this long journey is the analysis itself, and the incessant rereading of fundamental papers such as Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Discontents in Civilization, The Future of an Illusion, among others. But I will add also literature, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, Woolf, Paul Auster. We should all remember that Freud was a huge reader of literature, and he considered literature with the very linked to clinical work. Thank you.
So, thank you, Ms. Eisenstein. It was a very penetrative and even daring presentation on a very complex question indeed, that deals with issues that concerns us deeply as psychoanalysts, especially within today's general societal condition and changes. The points you made are even more interesting as they come from an analyst with your vast experience, who on the top of that has held various leading positions within the psychoanalytic community all over the world. Waiting for questions to come, and I invite you to freely write your questions and comments. I'll start our discussion by stopping for a minute to some of the issues that caught my attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, as I was reading your speech, preparing for this webinar, the question of ethics dominated my thinking. And I remember an article of yours published some 25 years ago in the Greek journal Ektonisteron, where you argued that if psychoanalysis per se is beyond ethics, meaning that there is no specific ethic of psychoanalysis, since, as Freud says, the psychoanalysis is not a Weltanschauung. On the contrary, there are ethics in psychoanalysis, and the core issue, you wrote then, concerns the ethics of psychoanalysts. I quote you, "The ethics of psychoanalysts are in close relation with the psychoanalytic technique and make the analyst responsible in regard to his practice. They concern as well his relation to the transmission of psychoanalysis and to analytical institutions." End of quote. So it is clear that the ethics of the psychoanalyst depend on the transference within the psychoanalytic relationship. And I believe this is where the transgenerational dimension interferes, since, as you further clearly state in that same article, I quote you again, Psychoanalysis takes place within a community, even an imaginative one, and is transmitted freely, either we like it or not, like life or like a sexually transmitted virus. End of quote. So when Freud pleads for some fundamental principles, such as abstinence or neutrality, and formulates recommendations regarding the technique, he nevertheless underlines the need of their applications with elasticity. If the analyst is to stay open, as you said also today, before the unexpected, the different, the uncertain of human psychic functioning, of his patient and his own. So the question is, what does the word elasticity include?
Mm.
Uh, the shift from authority to authoritarianism. Your remarks create to me at least a somewhat uncanny feeling.
Mm.
Despite describing something familiar in a way, they are also painful to accept. Perhaps because we tend to idealize the analytic world, believing that people who have been analyzed and have become analysts would have worked through their more primitive urges, narcissistic deficiencies, or castration issues. The question becomes more complex when you say that these individuals can be successful as analysts and at the same time behave in a narcissistic or even perversive way within the analytic society. I feel it's more than a contradiction, and I wonder with what kind of dichotomy we are dealing with.
Mm.
So, furthermore, reflecting very persuasively how humiliation and submission may dominate in some supervision sessions, and furthermore, presenting as you did what we might call the malignant face of authority through Utrilas Robles' imaginary psychoanalytic society, ruled by a perverse narcissistic individual, and discussing the consequences of such a personality on her society and colleagues, namely idealization and their extreme submission. You underline the transgenerational aspect of such phenomena, and you concluded, I quote now, it doesn't take much, just one person to undermine a psychoanalytic institution. Talking mostly of small psychoanalytic institutions, and you made the difference with a big one like the French one. But nevertheless, the question would be, is really just one person enough? And I say this because at the individual level, we know that the partner of a perverse narcissistic personality has also some characteristics that push him or her to choose and furthermore to stay within such a relationship. And when it comes to groups, history, but also the actual socio-political condition and the rise of the fascist ideologies, teaches us that the regression of the superego in crowds is possible under some socioeconomical conditions leading to fear and insecurity. Conditions that allow the malignant charismatic leader to take advantage of this fragility and impose his ideal as the only possible, would say, solution in times where pre-existing ideals or ideology have been a source of frustration. I would like to add, I was thinking that the perfect charismatic leader or ideology must do something further. And I'm referring to the perversion of words and of language. the perversion of the meaning of words that represent commonly shared values, such as freedom or equality, for example. We had the opportunity, Ms. Eisenstein, some years ago to think about this perversion of words on the occasion when you discussed Lanthimos films, The Dogtooth, where we have an extreme example of this perversion of words. So I totally agree with you concerning the crucial distinction you make between transmission and education regarding the psychoanalytic training. I don't know if we can deal today with this very big question. However, I would like to ask you whether, from your experience, you believe that the institution of what you used to call didactic analysis enhances or rather reinforces the phenomena you are referring to. So, you've also mentioned that under the circumstances of an authoritarian training, candidates get either depressed or become loyal vassals. However, for candidates as well as for members, there is also the option of de-investing the society and its activities, or even leaving it. So, as the history of psychoanalysis teaches us, repetitive splittings are well known within the psychoanalytic movement from its beginnings. So one might ask, and I think it's a question that comes in your speech very often, even if it sounds paradoxical. Is the risk of intellectual terrorism inherent to the psychoanalytic community? And if so, what is specific to this community, to the psychoanalytic community, that can lead to such results? Finally, when you suggested the possibility to turning to group analysts as a way to avoid such phenomena or to investigate such phenomena, to work through such phenomena. So, yes, after Freud, the group analysts have elaborated on the mechanisms within group functioning that can lead to distortions and destruction of that functioning. But despite the reluctance or the resistance of psychoanalytic societies to turn to group analysis, as you said, what can guarantee that group analysts haven't undergone similar intellectual terrorism? Some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Elisa Nicolopoulou. Your discussion is very, very rich and very condensed. So I will pick up 2 or 3 points. Group, and I start with the end of your group analysts. When they come to a society, they are at work with a new material. I mean, I think they are, as we analysts are with our patients, which can be, as I said, very different, because I know very good analysts who are very disagreeable and very authoritarian in life with the other colleagues, but we know, because we can meet patients, that they have been really right and patient and good for their patients. So that leads me, but I cannot, I wrote this paper and I'm still with questions, a lot of questions, unresolved. I do not consider I resolved anything in my description. But I think the problem is the question of the transference. Transference in the cure is a very precious tool of the analyst who has his countertransference. And you know that I think I agree with Lacan, who said that transfers and countertransfers are the same and unique phenomenon. It goes like that. So transference in the analysis is a precious tool, but transference in a society, and we all know that we have different transference with previous patients who became analysts, with our supervisors, some intellectual leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And I think their transfer becomes a very, very dangerous tool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are some questions coming. The one is from an anonymous attendee. Can transmission of freedom and education work to build on each other? This is one question.
Mm.
And perhaps I'll say another one.
Shall I answer?
Yes, of course.
Yes, I agree with this question.
Mm-hmm. Shall I go to the next one?
Mm-hmm.
Was Freud, it's a question from Gabriela Cusita.
Mm-hmm.
Was Freud, as a narcissistic charismatic leader, in brackets, narcissistic charismatic leader, trying to create clones by chasing away whoever would have different opinions, as he did, for instance, with Ferenczi? I would like your opinion on Freud's narcissism as an authority of the psychoanalytic school, and how Freud's behavior marked what would follow in the future of psychoanalysis. And she's thanking you for today.
Thank you for the question. Yes, you know, Freud, I will see him first as a fighter, because to write his paper of 1905, saying that kids, very little children, have a sexuality, can you imagine what bomb it was in that time? You must be very, very brave to have the courage to make such assumptions. So, of course, one could say that he must have had a strong narcissism to be able and promote all this movement of the first psychoanalysts. I don't know. I don't know what he did, how he was with his colleagues. We all know the example of Ferenczi. And we know that some other analysts, I'm thinking of Grodek, and I don't know whom, would be not thrown out, but pushed aside by Freud. But I cannot, I don't have enough elements to respond to this question.
Shall we take the next one?
Mm-hmm.
It's from Eleni Veinoglu. Eleni Veinoglu. Would you care to elaborate on the dangerousness of transfers in the institution?
Mm. Yes, because transfer in the institution is not a tool for understanding, but it becomes in my mind very often, not generally, but very often, a tool for dominating. People who admire so much, we can say it's transference, of course, it is. But it's a transference that is not interpretable. That is the big problem.
Yeah. Not worked through in a way.
Yes, it cannot be worked through.
Mm.
I was reading this morning in the papers, and it was terrifying. A man who was saying that his son, who was 20 years old, was in love with Elon Musk. And that he didn't know how to contain this madness.
Mhm. So a question from Dimitris Jackson. You spoke of the creation of the devoted vassals or disciples. But can the danger of conformity lead to an even more malignant outcome, the creation of false self-candidate analysts who are no longer devoted to uncovering truth, both within themselves as analysts or in our patients? Could this be a corruption of psychoanalytic values as well as ethics?
Yes, Dimitri, I totally agree with your comment. Of course, the danger is the creation of whole generations of analysts who become false selves because they submitted and they renounced to think by themselves. And that is for me an auto-mutilation. So this is exactly what you say. It is the creation of a large rank of false selves. And I would say that it's also the same reason why it's so difficult to come out of this terrible repetition, because false self will become training analysts who are as the one who terrorize them. And it increases the repetition compulsion of societies.
Okay. A question by Theodora Scalici is coming again in the question of transference in the society, and she says, "What do you mean by saying, if I understood correct, that transfers in the society between colleagues, between me and supervisors, or me and an ex-patient of me? Can you say more? That is, we have transfers in all those circumstances, I believe. So since it is happening all the time, what would you suggest institutes to do about it?"
Well, this is exactly the problem. I have no solution to offer. My only solution is to try to be aware of what is going on and try to work it through.
And try to?
To work it through. I don't see other solutions. Because, of course, transfers exist in societies. I can imagine that maybe it exists also in big companies where, after all, the director or the leader can be admired. But I think it's little different. It's more, I would say, more distorted in analytic societies. Because it's not only admiration.
But it's not only admiration, but
Not only admiration. It becomes identification.
okay.
Because you
Yes.
can admire without identify. I'm afraid in societies, analytic societies, it's the problem of idealization, identification.
Mm.
In the IPA, you know, there is often not often, but sometimes the IPA turns for a group which is or a new group, but sometimes an old group, which seems to go to hell. We have a cabinet of group analysts based in London, and we sometimes use them. I sent them once in a very, very highly dysfunctioning group somewhere in Russia, and it was very fruitful.
Yes.
Because it's also a new eye. It's a new gaze on the situation.
With long-lasting results. Who knows? We have a question by Kassiani Feleki. She says René Caes proposed that what is supposed to be ideology is in fact the need for safety and envy against any differentiation that threatens to impose thought, which is painful, that threatens to impose thought, which is painful. And she's asking your opinion about René Caes.
Yes, I greatly admire the work of René Caes. I think he's absolutely great. And I must say that I totally agree with what he says. Of course, finally, it's quite, what I tried to say is finally quite close. I didn't refer to him because I took other paths, but I didn't refer to, but I think what I said is quite close to Cass's work.
So, mhm. Maria Elena Spiropoulou, she's saying that in the last conference of the Greek the Hellenic Psychoanalytic Society, many analysts, as they listened to the case of an American psychoanalyst who was a guest of them, insisting on asking if this is an analysis. Is this an analysis of the clinical work they heard? Is it a danger if what we know as an analysis stands as an authoritarian thought toward what is new in psychoanalysis? What is analysis? There is someone who holds that holy grail.
That is exactly the question. That is exactly the question, because we all, unfortunately, we are all, it's totally human, a little afraid of something new.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the new is better than the old. But there is the fright, we are frightened by new and by changing. So the danger is exactly what Marilia Aisenstein said, is to say this is not analysis because it's something new.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I don't know exactly the context
Of what happened
of what.
well, it was a clinical material presented, and many of the people participate of the audience considered that the way the analyst was conducting the analysis was not analytical.
Yes, but that's I think that's a judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an idea, because one could say, personally, I can say I would have done differently.
Mm-hmm.
But I never would dare to say to a colleague, this is not analytic.
Mm-hmm. We hear it very often, and especially as you mentioned during the supervisions. I mean, younger colleagues, but also not only supervision in group works among analysts. We hear it very, very often. I think it's the most often. This
Mm.
is not analytical. This is not analytical.
And this is totally, totally irrelevant. When
Hmm.
I say it's not my way of practicing analysis.
So the question would be, what makes an intervention or an attitude analytical?
Yes.
I think it refers to what I was trying to say before about what is the core of psychoanalysis. Okay, uh, so and how we work through this core of psychoanalysis and unconscious, etc., may have different paths of approaching it.
Mm.
Let's say. Uh, So, Irene Ivanovic, she wants to thank you for the sharing of your open-mindedness and the free and genuine expression of your thoughts. Irene Ivanovic.
Thank you.
And a question again from Theodora Scali. I say again because she about the danger of transfers again. She asked before also. Could we say that we could think in another way on the basis of Fuchs' ideas about the same time we influence society influence us? Could it be a way to overcome it, the strong notion that apart from all this, on the societal level, we have to take over our responsibility for behave ourselves? I don't find very clear. I don't know if you
Mm.
understood the question. For me, it's not very clear.
I
If
don't I don't know very well to what she refers in Fuchs, naming Fuchs.
Fuchs,
Yes.
yes.
If you could explain a little to what she refers, what she
Hmm.
has in mind.
Okay. And then there is Yanis Vardzopoulos.
Mhm.
We teach how unconscious fantasies construct our inner and outer reality. The tool we possess is what is taking place within the analytic session. Analyst and analysant are the only agents authorized to know in Bionian terms, in K knowledge terms, what really has taken place in the session. To what extent do we possess reliable tools to transmit this knowledge to others, who by definition do not participate in this experience? Isn't there a point where authoritarianism interferes with?
Mm. I agree with the point that Dr. Batzopoulos does. I will totally agree. But after all, the question remains to me. I totally agree with the idea that only the analyst and the analysant can say something about what happened in a session or in a cure.
Yes, that's what he says.
Yes, absolutely. That I totally agree. Now, of course, we have the problem of supervisions.
Yes.
Because there is a supervisor who looks into a session of his supervisee.
Mm-hmm.
But here again, I go to the previous question. I think the supervisor could say, no, you know, I wouldn't have handled this as you did.
Mm-hmm.
But I would certainly, as a supervisor, never say it's not analytic or it's not good. And that comes back also to another question about how we transmit. It's difficult to transmit to young people that they have to deal and think by themselves. And that everything they think can be interesting. Instead of identifying with others and becoming false self, as Dimitri said, pointed out. Now, we can also see that there is authority. I think authority is a good thing, as I said, a valuable valence of authority.
Yes, a value.
Yes, I think that authority is has a very valuable quality. Of course, in societies, you must have rules.
Of course. Yes.
And rules that are protecting.
Mm. And I was thinking when you mentioned Freud and the regression of the superego in crowds, which is one of his very interesting works. I mean, he's talking about crowds,
Yes.
nevertheless. And, well, a society, bad or not bad, I mean, is not a crowd, it's an organized community.
Mm.
So I don't know if can apply, you know, this idea of regression of the superego.
No, I didn't apply this, the regression of the superego. I didn't apply it to movements in the societies.
Ah, okay.
I was referring to the fact that some leaders want the others to identify with them
Mm-hmm.
in a way which is dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. I was waiting for Theodora Scali whether she could reformulate her question because it wasn't very, very clear to me and to you apparently. So waiting for that. We'll take. She did. She did. She did. My meaning is this: can we say that on the level of institute members' relationship and on the level of society, we have to take our responsibility for equal relationships? For example, do I want? Oh, just a moment, because do I want to be admired as former teacher, therapist, analyst, or to cooperate with the other for better and worse?
Yes, well, the only thing I can say is, of course, I try to do the second
Mhm.
possibility. I don't know if I always succeed, but this is my ethics.
Mhm. There are some participants who are wondering whether your speech is going to be published or whether it's going to be online, written.
Yes.
But I think it's a question we'll see.
Yes, we can see. I have no problem in having it online.
Online, yes, the webinar, but whether you would like to give your speech
Yes,
in a written text.
I
But
I, I agree. I would send the text to
okay.
you asked it from.
Vasiliki Mimoglu is her question: are we too old in mind, not in age, or too young, so that we need psychoanalytic rules to be followed to the letter, to accept new ways of working analytically? And what about approaching psychosomatic patients psychoanalytically? Thank you for your insights.
Well, approaching psychosomatic patients, somatic patients, I would rather say, in in an analytic way or frame. Of course, I worked more than 20 years in the Psychosomatic Institute, and I think that it's very, very valuable. And it's a good example that she brings because, of course, the treatments with them are totally based on a psychoanalytic thinking. But the technique but has to be adapted. So that shows exactly what we are seeing, the resistance to the new. The first psychosomaticians in Paris, they were considered at one point as a dissidents. The other analysts saying that is not analysis.
It's not analytic. Mm-hmm.
But now, hopefully, they include us.
Yes. There are many people thanking you. The question of whether Miss Eisenstein will give her paper in written has been answered. Yes, she's willing to do that. Uh, and Gabriella Utsita thanks you again for saying that it was so beautiful. No, it was so beautiful and so soothing and feeling for an analyst to be given the right to have a mind of her own, and there the way Freud did, as you said. Mr. Jonathan Sklar, you said one person can take down a society. Hitler took down the Berlin Psychoanalytic Society, and later the German, the Deutsche Psychoanalytic, was thrown out of the IPA, and later the German one was thrown out of the IPA. We live in Trump world where he might sign a letter shutting down psychoanalysts in America. Our world is becoming more dangerous again. Thank you, Jonathan Sklar.
Yes, Jonathan, I totally agree. I feel our today's world is really dangerous. With all the extreme right wing coming back in Europe, Trump in America, Putin in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
It's really difficult because I have the impression, and that I agree with Jonathan, that there's democracy is falling apart.
Well, Freud's books were burned under Hitler, no? Yes, I was thinking, you've spoken and written about the distraction of the process of thinking.
Yes.
And with everything going on around us, I was often thinking of what you wrote, whether we are living in processes that destroy thinking.
Yes, yes.
Because you have also the AI to think about,
Yes, absolutely.
artificial intelligence.
Mm-mm.
And so we become lazy of thinking also. Well, I mean, we want to avoid ways of thinking. And with what is going on socially, perhaps there are processes we are not even conscious of that destroy
Yes,
processes of thinking.
I really think that the thinking process is really attacked.
Attacked.
Yes.
That's the word.
We are in a fast, everything fast. No patience, no passivity.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't want passivity, thinking needs passivity. Thinking needs passivity, and the waiting. Thinking is a way of not doing immediately, but waiting to work through and to think. The question of passivity seems so important to me.
I think we need also new words, because the passivity we are talking now is a constructive situation. We are living with a passivity that is a sort of not life, of something, as if we are under how we call it, anesthesis,
Anesthetized.
Anesthetized, as if we were anesthetized. This is not. This is the bad phase of passivity. Let's say the passive. I mean, the word passivity is something I believe analysts uh, understand because they are working with that and they have worked themselves from around that. But because I would like, so we have two more questions, new questions, even more perhaps, from Aris Emmanuel Alexiou. Thank you for your inspiring, daring arguments. I have two questions to ask. Does the notion of eligibility criteria regarding psychoanalytic education have to do with authority or authoritarianism? Are these criteria necessary? Should they be more flexible? And subsequently, who can determine who is and who is not able or fit to become an analyst? That is the first question.
Mhm.
I say the second one also.
Yes.
The second, are authorities and fanaticism relevant to the unwillingness, hesitancy, or refusal of psychoanalytic and many other institutions to speak up against the condemned wars and institutions supporting states conducting or founding them?
The first part, I understand the question. Yes, I think that authority in its good valence, as I said in the beginning of my speech, we must be, it must exist in psychoanalytical societies, in training committees, and in admissions. That I totally think authority is welcome there. The last part of the question I didn't catch, I didn't understand.
Whether authoritarianism and fanaticism are relevant to the unwillingness or refusal of psychoanalytic and many other institutions to speak up against the wars, against the everything that is happening socially.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always say that, of course, we can talk and think of everything. Nothing is not thinkable. But we are not sociologists and we are not politics. So we remain in our field.
Mm-hmm. A question by Sotiris Manolopoulos.
Mm-hmm.
Transferences do not develop only in analysis, but also in the life space of a society. They are ways to be together. They can be mild, basic positive transference, or neurotic, or perverse, or psychotic transferences. The colleagues cannot interpret the transferences that develop in the life space of the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Can we say that these everyday transferences are necessary as a way that members link to each other? However, they can help a member to be aware and face his transferences and take them where they belong, in his personal self-analysis and self-supervision.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. But I agree with Sotiris, but I would add that transference is not only in analytic society or analysis, because we all transfer in all our life. Little babies, very young kids, they fall in love with a little trunk or a doll, especially one.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, isn't it already transferential? It is already transferential, I think. I think there are a lot of women who transfer on their hair cutters,
On her?
coiffeur,
Ah. Yes.
or beauty shops. It's transfers too.
Mm-hmm. It's trans.
It is when you say, Elisa, when you hear, I can do 20 kilometers to go to my hairdresser because he's the best of the world, and I will never go to another.
Mm-hmm.
It's transference.
Yes. So we Evgenios, someone is asking, can we consider intellectual terrorism as a symptom manifestation of the intergenerational transmission of trauma in our culture related to the dissociation of thinking from the body and from feelings? Aren't we dealing with Ferenzi's wise baby? What I mean is the phenomenon of over-investment of the mind. Has the highly intellectual language of psychoanalysis forgotten that Freud owes many of his discoveries to literature or poetic sensitivity?
Yes, I think I told that exactly. So I totally agree. The question made me think of Winnicott. Uh, you know, there's a page where Winnicott says something very interesting. He says, it is the mother who she's indwelling the psyche of the baby with his body. And he says, if this indwelling cannot happen, then the body and there will be a splitting body psyche, and the psyche is in danger to be seduced by the mind, which I think is very close to the question. Seduction of the mind on the psyche. And that because of a splitting body psyche.
Yes. Magdalini Georgiakou is asking whether at the end, not being authoritarian seems to be a matter of personal ethics. Is the ethical constitution of analysts influenced by the analytic training? To what extent are narcissistic defenses analyzable?
Now, I will come to something very pessimistic. I think that mild narcissism can be analyzed but what Rosenfeld calls the narcissistic shield. In my practice, in my experience,
Mm-hmm.
I never succeeded. There's always a rupture or something. But of course, people who are so early wounded to have to protect themselves with these shelves, they feel totally in danger if they abandon it.
Mm-hmm.
So I won't blame them, but my experience is that I never succeeded this.
Yes. There are many people writing to thank you for your inspiring speech and for all the discussion. And many people are eager to read your paper. So I would like to say, so that I don't mention everybody, that you will be able to see the comments and see the people thanking you. So you'll have that possibility. Uh, yes, I think many things turn around the training of the analyst.
Yes, of
I
course.
mean, with what criteria someone gets eligible to become a future analyst? How is the training? Does the training proceed? Um what allows for this training to safeguard the the freedom of thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Um and it brings me to mind, since you mentioned Winnicott before, the question of loyalties.
Mm-hmm.
There is a meeting um, at that time where Winnicott is very furious with Melanie Klein because about the death instinct.
Mm-hmm.
Because Winnicott doesn't accept the death instinct, and he believes that Klein speaks about the death instinct, but in a way that she's not also um, following Freud's idea about the death instinct, and she's making something of her own. And so they are arguing, and at one point, Winnicott says, or I think says, and then writes, uh, how we must be critical about our loyalties.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so yes, I mean, we have a psychoanalytic corpus and psychoanalytic clinical experience that are very valuable. But how can we freely and not as vassals, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
think even about the theory? Because Freud himself changed his mind, I mean, about different concepts throughout his work.
Yes, absolutely. Right. What is think his thought is in total, in complete evolution at any point
Mm-hmm,
of his youth. It's impressive to see how he comes back and resays and comes back again. It's it's very impressive.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's very impressive. So, wouldn't that most of the advances in psychoanalysis uh, came because once the example you gave was psychosomatics. At one point or another, uh, either a clinical situation or a theoretical concept was not enough. I mean, the tools we had were not enough.
Exactly, exactly.
And that's how things
Evolve,
go further, evolve.
evolve, yes. I will give you my experience, especially when I was a lot in the IPA and abroad and in the EPF.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we had meetings with colleagues. I was saying to myself, what kind of theory he has? Or he was completely Kleinian or relational or Kohutian, things that don't speak to me. I considered that I'm Freudian. And after, when we came to clinical groups,
Mm-hmm.
the same that I had criticized to myself, I discover that they are beautiful analysts in clinical work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I mean, the the core of analysis is the clinical work. And after, as Freud did, he started with the clinical work. After we elaborate our theories,
Mm-hmm.
it can be true, or can we don't know. We don't know which one is truer than the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they help us to think
Yes.
about the patient.
Yes. I would like to say to Mr. Stavrianos, who I'm reading your questions, but they're not obvious to me. You are asking whether we receive any specification for observation. That's not very obvious what you are asking, to receive any specification for observation. So I read your questions, but you need to be more specific. uh, So there is a question from Anita Plume.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for this very valuable sharing of your thoughts, provoking my own thinking. Thank you for your so human, free, and professional at the same time. The best example to follow. Also, one can hear certain hope for the development of psychoanalysis, even though it is so difficult in small groups.
Mm.
That's Anita Plum, but other people also still, as
Yes.
Theodora Scali and other people, are thanking you very much and are very grateful. I'll see whether we have another question. It's clear that your paper gave us much food for thought, that's for sure, and opens many questions. And I thank you when you say that there are no answers, because if there were answers, we wouldn't have been thinking so much about the questions. uh, it's difficult phenomena. They are real.
Mm.
We are experiencing them. Many
Yes.
of us have experienced similar phenomena of intellectual terrorism. And when uh, when someone is brought up in an education system that
Mhm.
doesn't allow free thinking,
Yes. Yes.
uh, perhaps it's one reason more to not to react immediately to intellectual terrorism.
Yes.
Uh, so one question would be whether psychoanalysis uh, can remain untouched by the attacks of thinking that surround us.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Personally, I'm not very optimistic, but uh,
Well, I think
but it's a struggle. I mean, it's a struggle.
it's a struggle, and it's a struggle, and we must try to survive.
Mm.
It's difficult, and it will be more and more difficult with Trump and Elon Musk and I don't know whom.
But yes, you see, it's very delicate because Freud himself and then other analysts and analysts today in countries where there is war continue to do analysis, and people go to their analyst through bombs and through
Yes, yes.
distracted, and so there are people that would say, but don't you take into account what is happening outside? And you are two people in a room discussing about this and that, uh, as if you were in your own bubble. Uh,
To
so,
me, no,
yes, and please go on.
to me, Elisa, analysis, it's not so much the cure of symptoms, but the capacity, it must restore the capacity of thinking.
Mm.
Working through is thinking. And I totally agree with Hannah Arendt, who says the evil is not thinking.
Yes. Hmm.
So, of course, when people come among bombs or hide themselves to come to an analysis, I think it's a way of continuing to think.
Yes. Safeguard the thinking.
Yes.
Hmm. Safeguard thinking. I don't see any other questions. Shall we wait a moment or wrap it up here? What do you say? Well, time goes by, huh? Would you like to add something more, Miss Eisenstein?
I would like to, first of all, to thank you, Elisa, for your discussion and introduction. And I will also like to thank the auditors who were patient enough to be here.
Hmm. In fact, we thank you for your contribution and all, as I said before, the very interesting issues you developed. Many people are thanking you online also. Uh, I still have the question how come one to be a perverse narcissist and at the same time be a good analyst? I always have this question. I mean, how, if we come back to Dimitris Jackson's, how can a personality be a false personality in certain circumstances and a true personality in contact with his body and himself and his feelings at another case?
I agree with Dimitri. A false personality cannot be a good, certainly not.
Hmm.
Narcissistic, wounded person can be horrible with his colleagues and in life. But because his narcissism is preserved by the frame of analysis, he can put it aside for analyzing the other. That is my way of thinking of it. Because he's not threatened.
No, I was thinking, and I'm coming back to it because sometimes during many times in analysis, we are confronted with difficult issues,
mm,
with the violence of the patient. I mean, the overt violence, not the
mm,
latent, the overt violence, or uh, an attack to what we say are our blind spots, that we don't know them. I mean, so I was wondering whether, when the equilibrium is very, very thin,
mm,
uh, such a personality, I mean, I can understand what you say, that through the traumas, etc., he can be very assisting to his patients and listen in a different way. But when the equilibrium is very, very thin, I wondered whether this malignant part of his character would not come about and perhaps be authoritarian with his patient,
mm.
in a way.
It's
That,
possible. It's possible, of course.
it's a possibility.
It's a possibility, yes.
So I have one last question, and then we'll wrap up the webinar. It's a question from Deis Serava about what you think about teleanalysis and nowadays virtual relations.
Personally, I'm really, really, really totally against teleanalysis. I do supervisions on Zoom or even Skype, but never, never, never a treatment. When I was involved in the IPA as chair of the ING's, International New Groups, I wrote a small paper with the chair of the ethic committee and the chair of the uh, study politic director, saying that in very, very rare circumstances, when it was absolutely impossible for someone to be longly 3 or 4 years somewhere, that he had to go back, we could accept online analysis, but it was to be, they had to come every month for 3 days to be also in person. Because analysis without the bodies in the same room, well, we had the confinement. Many of my supervisors were telling me, oh, it's great, it's great. They speak much more than usually. And I was saying, they speak much more because there's nobody, so no resistance. But I don't know how it can be worked through after. So that I'm very, very, very critical of the last decisions of the IPA.
Yes, that 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 is what I was meaning when I said before we must think of what kind of elasticity we are talking, uh, which is something that must remain unchangeable, and where can we be
Exactly.
have elasticity.
Elasticity has its own limits.
Mm-hmm. So I think if you don't have, do you have anything more to add?
No, no, thank you.
So I think we can thank you again very, very much for your contribution, as I said before, and everything you gave us the opportunity to discuss about. There are some small questions, but I think it's time to stop now, so we won't take them. Um, Before ending, I would like to remind you that this pre-symposium will be in a few days available online on the Symposia social media and website for those of you who have registered. Also that the board of the Delphi Symposium is planning one more pre-symposium webinar, like this one, for which you will receive soon further details. And of course, to remind you, the Delphi International Psychoanalytic Symposium itself, which will be held from the 27th to the 30th of August 2026. Thank you all for your participation. Thanks, Ms. Aisenstein.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Bye.
Deeply.